I'm going to tell this story the way I've already told it 3 times. To 2 different therapists who both suggested I process the trauma, to 1 deputy who kept glancing at his watch, and to exactly 1 person who knew the cabin's owner well enough to make a phone call that actually got returned. I'm not going to make it prettier than it was, and I'm not going to pretend I've figured out what we encountered up there in those old mountains. Before we start, I need to address something because people get hung up on labels. When I use the phrase skinwalker-like, I'm using it the same way someone might say wolf-like, as a descriptor, not a claim of cultural knowledge. I'm not Navajo. I'm not going to appropriate anyone's traditions as narrative decoration. The Appalachian Mountains have their own lexicon of fear, boogers, haints, things you don't name after sunset. Whatever stalked us through those woods belongs to that darker folklore, something that steals the shape of familiarity and wields it like a weapon, leaving you questioning whether your own senses can be trusted. This happened during a week-long cabin rental in the Appalachians, mid-October, when the autumn leaves burn so bright it looks like the entire mountainside is lit from within, but the shadows between the tree trunks have already gone winter dark and hungry. There were 4 of us initially. Me, my wife Nora, my college friend Eric, and Eric's younger sister Maddie, who'd just escaped a toxic relationship and needed somewhere quiet to rebuild herself. The cabin listing promised remote, authentic, historic, realtor code for you won't have cell service and nobody will hear you scream. But that's exactly what we wanted. I'm self-employed and always tethered to screens. Nora had just survived a brutal quarter at her firm. Eric and Maddie had been living in paper-thin apartments where you could hear your neighbors' entire lives through the walls. We craved a place where you could sit on a porch and hear nothing but wind moving through trees and maybe water running over stone. We wanted to feel small in a good way, the way wilderness makes you small. The listing seemed almost too perfect. Hand-hewn logs, cast iron stove, original spring house, historic property once used as a way station for early settlers and later by a logging family. Photos showed a porch swing, a gravel drive disappearing into mist, a handwritten note in the house rules that read, "No pets, no exceptions." That detail stood out because most cabins in that region advertise dog-friendly, like it's a constitutional right. The owner's name was Cal, and all communication came through terse messages that felt friendly but controlled. When I asked questions, I got answers that addressed exactly what I'd asked. Nothing more, nothing less. Like a man who'd learned through hard experience what happens when you volunteer extra information. The drive-in. We took 2 vehicles because we'd packed a week's worth of groceries, hiking gear, and Eric's borderline absurd enthusiasm for bringing a small telescope. We left early to beat weekend traffic, and the drive started normal enough. Highways bleeding into state routes narrowing into two-lane roads becoming paths with names that sounded like warnings. The last half hour was gravel, not the nice maintained kind you see in suburban developments, but the tooth-rattling kind with deep ruts and fist-sized stones that ping off your undercarriage and make you question every life choice that led to this moment. The forest pressed in from both sides, and the ridge lines kept stacking behind each other like layers in a photograph, each one darker than the last. The first strange thing happened before we even reached the cabin. We passed a handmade sign nailed to a tree at the edge of a pull-off. Just a weathered plank with black paint. Letters uneven like someone had painted it in a hurry or in poor light. It said, "Turn back after dark." No property name, no phone number, nothing official. It wasn't the standard, no trespassing sign you see everywhere. This felt personal, like a warning left by someone who knew something specific. Eric laughed it off as a Halloween decoration. Maddie snapped a photo through the window. Nora didn't laugh, but she didn't argue either. She just stared at it too long, like she was trying to decide if it was a joke or a message meant for someone specific. First night at the cabin. The cabin sat at the end of a short spur off the gravel road, tucked into a bowl of trees with one open view toward a lower ridge. It looked exactly like the photos, which should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like arriving at a film set after the crew has gone home. Everything placed correctly, which somehow made it feel staged. The porch was wide, the swing hung from thick chains, and there were wind chimes made from cut metal tubes that looked too heavy to move in anything less than a gale. The front door had 2 locks, a normal deadbolt and a second one that was older, like something you'd see on a cellar door. There was also a hook-and-eye latch mounted higher than eye level, positioned like it was meant to keep something out or keep someone in. Inside smelled like cold wood and old smoke. Thick braided rugs, iron cookware, a faded quilt draped over the couch. Everything was clean, but not hotel clean. Clean like someone had come through and made sure nothing obvious could hurt you, but also like nobody had actually lived there in a long time. I noticed the windows immediately, not the glass, which was new enough, but the frames. The inside edges had scratches, long and shallow, as if something hard had been dragged along them repeatedly. Not random scuffs. Parallel lines, deliberate. Nora noticed them too, running her thumb along one before wiping it on her jeans like she expected to find grime. Probably raccoons, Eric offered. He was carrying a cooler and wanted everything to be normal. Raccoons don't scratch like that, Maddie said, then immediately looked like she regretted speaking up. She didn't want to be the anxious one. None of us did. We were there to relax. We did the standard cabin routine. Unloaded groceries, claimed bedrooms, made a first-night meal that was too heavy because we were hungry and excited and still operating on road trip energy. There was a 3-ring binder on the coffee table labeled Cabin Notes in thick marker. Inside were directions, emergency numbers, instructions for the stove, and a page titled Wildlife that read like it had been edited multiple times over the years. Black bears, common. Coyotes, common. Bobcats, rare. Feral hogs, present in some areas. Then, in different handwriting, one line. Do not go into the woods after dark. If you hear a person calling for help, do not answer. Lock the doors. It would be easy to say that's where we should have left. But the human mind has defense mechanisms for things like that. We treat them like quirks, file them under local color. Eric said it was probably aimed at tourists who get lost easily. Nora suggested maybe there were hunters who didn't want people wandering around at night. Maddie said nothing, just turned the page and pretended she hadn't read it twice. That first night, we sat on the porch with blankets and hot drinks because the air had that sharp edge that makes you feel awake. Stars were bright in the gaps between branches. Eric set up his telescope like it was a sacred ritual. We talked about nothing important. Around 10 p.m., the wind shifted and the chimes moved for the first time. They didn't tinkle like delicate chimes. They clanged low and hollow, like pipes in an empty building. It made all of us pause mid-sentence the way people pause when a dog suddenly growls. Then we laughed at ourselves because they were just wind chimes doing wind chime things. The voice. Around 11 p.m., when we were inside with the lights out, I heard a voice outside. Not close, maybe 50 yards away, down near where the driveway met the trees. A woman's voice calling, hello. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't frantic. It was the tone someone uses when they think they might be at the wrong house and don't want to be rude. I sat up in bed. Nora stirred and asked what it was. I didn't answer right away because I was listening for a second call, the way you listen for a second clap of thunder to confirm the first one wasn't something else. The voice came again, slightly closer, still calm. Hello? Is someone there? Nora sat up too. In the dark, you can hear the shape of someone's fear in their breathing. She whispered, is that Maddie? I knew it wasn't. Maddie's voice has a rasp at the end of words. This voice was too clean, too even. But Nora's question planted the first seed of doubt. What if it was Maddie and she'd stepped out and gotten turned around? We'd been drinking cider. People make dumb choices. I swung my feet to the floor and the cabin floor creaked loudly, like it was announcing my movement. The voice outside stopped. Then, after a pause long enough to feel deliberately timed, it said, it's cold. Can you help me? I got to the window and looked out through a gap in the curtains. The porch light was off, and the darkness outside was complete except for a faint wash of moonlight on gravel. I saw no one. No flashlight. No movement. Just trees. The voice came again, and this time it was closer to the porch, right at the edge of the lightless space beyond the steps. Please. I'm lost. Nora was behind me now, holding my arm like she could anchor me. I remember the line from the binder flickering through my mind. If you hear a person calling for help, do not answer. And I remember how stupid it felt in that moment to treat a line in a cabin binder like gospel. If a person is lost in the woods in October, you help them. That's the rule. That's what good people do. Eric's door opened across the hall. He whispered, you guys hear that? The voice outside changed just slightly, like a person adjusting to new information. Eric? Eric, is that you? Every hair on my arm stood up. There's a specific kind of cold that isn't about temperature. It's the recognition of something that should not be possible. We had not said Eric's name outside. Not loudly. Not recently. The voice had guessed correctly, and that should have been coincidence, but it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a hand reaching for the right tool in a drawer. Eric whispered back before any of us could stop him. "Who is this?" The voice answered immediately, too quickly, like it had been waiting for permission. Thank God. It paused, and in that pause I heard something that made my stomach tighten. The faintest click, like teeth touching. Then it said, "I'm Maddie." From down the hall came Maddie's sleepy voice, muffled by her door. "What?" All of us froze. The voice outside didn't falter. It continued in the same calm tone, now with an edge of irritation, like someone being contradicted. "Eric, open the door. I can't feel my hands." Eric took a step toward the front door. I grabbed his shoulder harder than I meant to. He jerked, startled, then turned to me in the dim hallway light like he was about to argue. Nora said very quietly, "Maddie is in her room." There was silence outside. In that silence, I could hear the creak somewhere below the cabin, steady and indifferent. Then the voice outside changed again, not to Maddie's real voice, but to something close enough that it made Maddie gasp behind her door. Please, I'm right here." I didn't think. I crossed to the front door and slid the deadbolt, then the older lock, then the hook latch, one motion after another, like I was sealing something. I didn't open it. I didn't speak. I just locked it louder than necessary, so whoever or whatever was outside would hear the finality. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then there was a sound on the porch steps, not footsteps exactly, more like something shifting its weight. Then, very softly, as if someone had leaned close to speak through the wood, the voice said, "Okay." That was it. No anger, no pleading, just acceptance. Then the porch steps creaked again, and the sound moved away into the trees. We stood in the hallway for a long time, listening. Eric's face looked pale even in the low light. Maddie had cracked her door open and was peering out like a frightened child. Nora's hand was still wrapped around my arm, and I could feel her pulse through her fingers. Eventually Eric whispered, "That was a prank." "By who?" Nora whispered back. Eric didn't have an answer, and that was the first time I saw him genuinely unsettled. He's the kind of person who narrates his fear as a way to manage it. That night, he didn't narrate anything. We went back to bed, but nobody slept. At some point near dawn I drifted off, and the last thing I remember before sleep took me was the wind chimes outside, completely still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Day 2, what we found in the woods. Day 2 was bright and almost aggressively normal. Sunlight streamed through trees, coffee steamed in our mugs. Maddie laughed too loudly at something Eric said, like she was trying to physically shake the night off her shoulders. When fear doesn't have a place to go, it turns into performance. I went outside and walked the perimeter of the porch and driveway, looking for footprints. The ground was hard-packed gravel with scattered leaves. If someone had stood on those porch steps, there should have been something. Mud, scuff marks, displaced leaves. I found nothing. Not even the kind of evidence you'd expect from a raccoon nosing around. The porch boards were clean. The only thing I found was a smell. It came in short waves, like it was caught in pockets of air. Wet fur and something sour underneath, like old meat left too long in summer heat. It wasn't strong enough to be a dead animal nearby. It was more like the lingering trace of something that had been there and then left. We decided to hike that day because staying in the cabin felt like hovering over an unanswered question. The area had trails, nothing official right off the property, but a Forest Service road a couple miles away connected to an old footpath. The binder mentioned a historic cemetery and an old logging grade, which sounded like the kind of local color that makes a trip interesting. We packed water, snacks, a basic first aid kit. Eric took a small GPS unit because he likes gadgets. Nora took a paper map because she doesn't trust gadgets. Maddie took pepper spray because she'd read too many true crime stories and didn't care if it made her look paranoid. The hike started pleasant enough. Leaves crunching underfoot, a creek crossing over slick stones, ferns and rhododendron thick enough in places that you could lose sight of the person ahead if they turned a corner. That kind of density makes you feel watched even in daylight, but we ignored it. We saw signs of normal wildlife, squirrel chatter, bird calls, deer scat. Then, maybe an hour in, we found the first thing that didn't fit. It was a deer carcass, but not the way you usually find one. Not a whole body left to rot. Not scattered bones picked clean by scavengers. This was arranged. The rib cage had been opened cleanly, the spine exposed, and the organs were gone. The legs were still attached, but twisted at angles that made me think of someone bending wire into shapes. The head was missing. Around the carcass, the leaves had been scraped away in a perfect circle, exposing damp soil like a shallow bowl. And on a low branch above it, someone or something had hung a strip of hide like a ribbon, swaying slightly in the breeze. Bear, Eric said immediately, because bears are the normal answer. But bears don't arrange. Predators drag and tear. This looked like deliberate placement, like someone had taken time to make it look a specific way. Nora stood a few feet back, her face tight. Maddie didn't come closer at all. She stayed behind us and whispered, "This is weird." I crouched and looked at the ground. There were tracks, but the leaf litter made them faint. I saw deer prints, yes, and what looked like dog paw prints but elongated. Then I saw something that made me straighten up fast. A human footprint, partial, pressed into the damp soil where the leaves had been scraped away. It wasn't crisp enough to see tread, which suggested barefoot or a very worn sole. It was adult-sized, and it was positioned too close to the carcass, like someone had stood there working. "Guys," I said, and my voice came out lower than I intended. Eric leaned in, saw it, and backed up. "Okay," he said, forcing a laugh that didn't land. "Okay, so hunters." Nora said nothing. She was staring at the strip of hide on the branch. In daylight, it looked less supernatural and more like something a person had done, which should have been reassuring. Instead, it was worse. A person had done this. A person had also been outside our cabin at night, calling names with a voice that didn't belong to anyone we knew. We left that spot quickly. We didn't linger to take pictures. Maddie didn't point her phone at it, which tells you how wrong it felt. We hiked back in near silence, all of us listening to the woods in a way that wasn't casual anymore. When you're relaxed, the forest is background noise. When you're not, every twig snap becomes information. The spring house and the crawl space. Back at the cabin, we found nothing disturbed. Doors locked, windows intact, no sign of anyone having been there. But the smell was back, faint, threading through the air like smoke. It seemed strongest near the side of the cabin where the spring house stood. The spring house was a small stone structure a short distance away, half sunk into the ground with a heavy wooden door. The binder had mentioned it as historic. Please do not tamper. Eric wanted to open it immediately. Nora said no. Maddie asked, "Why is it locked from the outside?" Because it was a hasp and padlock, new and bright against old wood. That night we made a plan like rational adults. Lights on outside, doors locked. Nobody goes out alone. If we hear anything, we don't answer it. We repeated that last part like a rule we'd all agreed to, and saying it out loud made it feel possible to follow. Around 9 p.m., the power flickered and went out. Not gradually, not like a storm rolling in, just a sudden cut, like someone had flipped a breaker switch. The cabin went dark except for the glow of the gas range clock, which kept blinking at us like a heartbeat. Eric swore. Nora lit candles with a steadiness that looked practiced. Maddie sat very still, hands clenched around her pepper spray like it could solve problems it absolutely could not solve. Outside, the wind chimes moved once, one heavy clang, and then stopped. I went to the window and looked out. Total darkness beyond the glass. No porch light obviously, but also no distant glow, no hint of another house anywhere. We were alone in a bowl of trees. Then, from somewhere behind the cabin, came a knock. Not on the door, on the logs themselves. 3 taps, evenly spaced, like someone testing a wall for stability. Eric whispered, "What the hell?" Another knock. Same rhythm. Then, from close enough that it seemed to come from the shadow just beyond the nearest window, a voice said conversationally, "Power's out." It was my voice. Not like my voice. Not similar. It had my cadence, the slight flattening I do at the ends of sentences when I'm stating a fact. It sounded exactly like me talking to myself. Nora made a small sound in her throat, half gasp, half choke. Maddie's eyes widened so much the candlelight reflected off the wet surface. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My brain was doing the fast, ugly math of fear. Someone heard you. Someone recorded you. Someone is outside. Someone is close. Someone has been close enough to learn you. But we hadn't said anything outside. We'd been inside all day. We'd been careful. The voice My voice continued, softer now, like it was trying to be reassuring. Hey, it's fine. I'm outside. Just open up. Eric whispered. Nope. As if saying it could keep the world stable. The voice paused. Then it said, Nora, tell him it's cold. Nora's face changed in a way I'll never forget. It wasn't just fear. It was the look of someone whose name has been used without permission, like a hand on the back of her neck. She whispered, barely audible, Don't. The voice outside made a sound that might have been a laugh, but it didn't have humor in it. It was a short exhale with a click at the end, like teeth touching metal. Then, very quietly, it said, Okay. And then it walked away. We sat in candlelight for a long time afterward, not speaking. At some point the power came back on by itself with another sharp flicker. The timing felt wrong. Outages happen, but they don't usually last exactly as long as a strange visit. They don't usually feel coordinated. That's when we finally opened the binder again, not as a quirky cabin accessory, but as a document that might save our lives. We read every page slowly, carefully. We found a section we'd skipped, a loose sheet tucked into the back cover like someone had hidden it there deliberately. A photocopy of an old newspaper clipping, yellowed and blurred. The headline was partially cut off, but I could make out enough. Local hunter missing. Search called off. The date was sometime in the 1970s. The article described a man who'd gone out alone, familiar with the area, never returned. There was a quote from a sheriff about dangerous terrain and wildlife. At the bottom, in pen, someone had written, He wasn't taken by the woods. He was taken by what borrows voices. The phrase hit me harder than it should have, because it was too close to what we'd experienced. Borrowed voice. Borrowed identity. A thing that uses your own people against you. Eric wanted to leave the next morning. Nora agreed immediately. Maddie didn't argue. I hesitated, not because I wanted to stay, but because leaving in fear felt like giving something power, and my ego wanted to believe I could outwit the unknown. That's a dangerous part of being human. We treat fear like a negotiation. The third night, we decided to sleep in the same room that night. Blankets on the floor, doors locked, lights on, like kids riding out a storm. We slept in shifts without calling it that. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd open them again minutes later, convinced I'd heard something. The cabin creaked. The wind moved branches. Normal sounds became suspects. Around 3 a.m., Maddie whispered, Do you hear that? At first I didn't. Then I did. Footsteps in the leaves outside. Slow and careful, circling the cabin. Not heavy boots. Not a deer's quick, light steps. Something bipedal, pacing deliberately. Then came a smell through the cracks of the window frame. Wet fur and that sour meat note again, stronger now, like an animal had pressed close enough to breathe on the glass. Then, from directly outside the window, a whisper. I can see you. It was Maddie's voice. Maddie's whole body jerked like she'd been touched by a live wire. She clapped a hand over her own mouth as if to stop her voice from being stolen a second time. Nora started to cry silently, tears just running down her face, without sound. Eric's hand found mine in the dark, gripping like we were bracing against a current. I forced my voice steady, more for my own sanity than anything else. I said, loud enough to be heard but not shouting, Go away. There was a pause. Then the voice outside said, still in Maddie's voice, calm and almost kind, Open the window. I'm right here. I didn't move. I didn't respond. I stared at the dark rectangle of the window and waited for something to press against it, to show itself. Nothing did. After a long minute, the footsteps moved away and the smell faded like it was being carried off on a slow breath of wind. Escape attempt. We left at first light, or we tried to. Eric's SUV wouldn't start. Not a weak crank. Nothing. Dead. We popped the hood and checked the battery terminals because that's what you do when you're pretending this is a normal problem. The terminals were intact. No corrosion. Then I noticed the battery cables had been cut clean through. Not chewed. Not frayed. Cut, like someone had used bolt cutters. We stared at the severed cables in silence, and the reality settled in like cold water. Someone had disabled our vehicle in the night. Not an animal. Not bad luck. A deliberate act. My car started, but when I put it in gear and began backing down the driveway, the rear end fishtailed hard. I stopped and got out, thinking I'd hit a slick patch. The back tire was flat. Not a slow leak. A clean slice on the sidewall, deep enough that it looked like it had been opened with a blade. I remember standing there in the gravel, staring at that cut, and feeling something shift in my mind from maybe to we are being managed. Someone or something was controlling our options, keeping us there. We didn't panic outwardly. Panic is loud, and loud feels unsafe. We moved with tight efficiency, like people in a disaster drill. We checked the spare, it was intact. We swapped the tire. We debated walking to the main road to look for help, but the main road was miles of gravel through forest with no guarantee anyone would pass. We debated calling the owner, Cal, but our phones had no service. Eric's GPS unit, which had been at 80% battery the night before, was dead. Not low dead. That was full, Maddie said, and her voice trembled with anger, which was a new emotion in the mix and honestly felt better than fear. We did the only thing we could. We climbed the ridge behind the cabin to try to find a signal. The ridge wasn't a marked trail. It was a steep climb through leaf litter and rocks, the kind of slope where you can feel your calves burn quickly. We moved single file, close together. Halfway up, we found another sign that didn't fit. A piece of bright orange survey tape tied around a sapling. Then another, like someone had marked a path. It could have been a forester, but it felt fresh, intentional, like breadcrumbs. About 20 minutes up, Nora stopped abruptly and pointed. A strip of cloth hung from a branch ahead, fluttering slightly. It was gray. It looked like a rag until I got close enough to see the stitching. It was from my shirt. Not similar, mine. The hem had a small tear from an old accident with a door hinge. I'd worn that shirt the day before. I'd taken it off in the cabin and tossed it in my duffel. I hadn't taken it outside. The cloth strip was tied to the branch like a marker. My mouth went dry. Maddie whispered, "How?" Eric's face went hard, which is what happens when his brain can't fit the facts into a story. He needs stories to function. He said, "Someone's messing with us." "Yes," Nora said, and there was no comfort in the word. But how did they get inside? We didn't have an answer. The cabin had been locked. We'd been awake most of the night. There had been no forced entry. And yet someone had accessed our belongings, taken a piece of my clothing, brought it up the ridge, and tied it like a message. We kept climbing because standing still felt like waiting to be found. Near the top, we got one bar of service for about 30 seconds. Eric's phone lit up with a delayed flood of notifications, then went back to nothing. In those 30 seconds, Nora managed to dial 911. The call didn't connect. Maddie tried to text her best friend. Message failed. I tried to call the cabin owner. Went straight to voicemail, like the number was disconnected. Then the service vanished as if it had never existed. The man on the ATV. On the way down, we heard an engine. A real one, not imagined. An ATV coming up the gravel road toward the cabin. We all stopped and looked at each other, because that sound in that place meant either rescue or another variable we couldn't control. A man on an old four-wheeler rolled into view, wearing a faded cap and a jacket that looked older than me. He was thin, weathered, the kind of person who looks carved by sun and wind. He saw us and slowed without surprise, like he'd expected to find people outside that cabin. His eyes flicked to our faces, then to the cabin behind us, then to the trees, as if checking something. "You folks the renters?" he said. Not a question. Eric stepped forward. "Yeah, our car. Someone cut the battery cables. And we heard someone outside at night." The man's expression didn't change much, but something tightened around his mouth. He nodded once, slowly. "Cal's place," he said. Again, not a question. "You know him?" I asked. The man looked at me for a long beat. Then he said, "I know the land." That answer felt like a warning. He killed the ATV engine, and in the sudden quiet, I heard the creak again, far off, steady. The man said, "You hear voices out here at night. You don't answer. You don't go looking. That's how folks end up a story." Maddie said, "What is it?" The man's eyes went past us toward the tree line. He said, "Some call it a booger. Some call it a hint. Some call it the borrowed man. Don't matter what you call it. It don't like lights. It don't like iron. It likes people who think they're helping." Nora's voice was tight. "Are you saying it's an animal?" The man shook his head just once. "I'm saying I've seen tracks that ain't right. And I've heard my own mama's voice calling my name from a place she's never been." He started the ATV again, then paused with his hand on the throttle. "You got a working vehicle, you leave before dark. You hear me?" Eric said, "We can't. They cut our battery." The man interrupted, louder now. "Then you walk. You don't stay another night." And then, like he'd said too much, he drove off. The engine noise faded down the road until the forest swallowed it completely. We stood in the gravel, 4 adults in daylight, and for the first time I felt something like despair. Because whatever this was, it wasn't just in our heads. A stranger had named it without us describing it. He'd repeated the exact rule from the binder. He'd confirmed, in his own way, that the impossible thing, your own voice used against you, was part of this place. The crawl space discovery. We made another plan. We'd repair Eric's battery cable if we could. We had tools, duct tape, a basic emergency kit. We'd get the SUV started, or we'd load essentials into my car and limp out on one vehicle. We'd leave before dark no matter what. While Eric worked on the battery, I checked the cabin again, methodically. Windows, locks, foundation. I looked for a crawl space or hidden entry, because the cloth strip from my shirt was now a fact that demanded an explanation. On the back of the cabin, partially hidden by stacked firewood, I found a small square hatch low to the ground, like root cellar access. It was latched from the outside with a simple sliding bolt. The wood around it showed wear, not from age, but from repeated opening and closing. I called Eric over. He looked at it, then at me, and I saw the moment he realized what it meant. There was an entry we hadn't checked, a way into the cabin that bypassed the front door, a way someone could slip in while we were distracted, while we slept, while we sat on the porch. It wasn't supernatural. It was logistics, and logistics are what make fear real. We slid the bolt and opened the hatch. The smell hit first, damp earth, mold, and the same sour animal note, stronger now. Inside was a shallow crawl space, more like a storage pit with stone walls and a dirt floor. There were shelves with old jars, empty now, and some rusted tools. And in the back corner, arranged neatly, were objects that made my stomach drop. Horseshoes, old iron nails, a coil of chain, and a circle of white powder on the ground, like someone had poured salt in a ring. In the center of the ring sat a small bundle wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. Nora whispered, "Don't." Of course I did anyway, because curiosity is another human weakness. I stepped over the ring without touching it and picked up the bundle. It was heavier than it should have been. I brought it into the light and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small notebook, leather-bound, the pages warped with age. And beneath it, a strip of dried skin, dark and stiff, with coarse hair on one side. Maddie made a choking sound and backed away. Eric said, "What is that?" I didn't answer because I didn't know, and saying, "I don't know," felt like inviting chaos. I opened the notebook instead. The handwriting was old-fashioned, tight, slanted. The first page had a date, 1936, a name, H.L. McCrae, and the first line, "If you find this, do not speak after dark." The next pages read like a work diary. At first, mentions of building, hauling timber, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the hard winter, men going missing. Then the tone shifted. There were entries about hearing voices, about men waking up outside without knowing how they got there, about a borrower that wears a face it didn't earn. One entry, dated late October, described a night when the writer heard his brother calling from the woods, begging to be let in. And the writer wrote, "I did not answer. I held iron in my hands until my palms bled. I looked up at the others. Nobody spoke. The cabin around us suddenly felt less like a rental and more like a place with a long memory, layered with other people's fear." Final night and escape. Eric's phone buzzed then, unexpectedly, like a jump scare. One bar of service had appeared. He glanced down and his face tightened. "Cal texted," he said. The message was short. "Everything okay?" The timing was so perfectly wrong it felt like mockery. Eric typed back immediately, fingers shaking. "No. Someone cut our cables. We heard voices outside. We found a crawl space with stuff. We're leaving." The reply came fast. "Do not go out after dark. Stay inside. I'll come by tomorrow." Nora said, "Tomorrow?" Eric showed her the screen. Maddie whispered, "He wants us to stay another night." I felt anger flare, hot and clean. "No," I said. "We leave now." We finished the battery repair enough to get Eric's SUV to start, though it coughed and sputtered like it didn't want to cooperate. My tire was changed, but I didn't trust it. We loaded essentials, wallets, keys, a few bags, and the notebook without discussing it, because none of us wanted to leave it there. As we were about to pull out, the wind chimes on the porch moved again. One slow clang. There was no wind. The trees were still. The sound came from a single tube, as if someone had touched it deliberately. I looked toward the porch. In the shadow beyond the swing, just at the edge where the porch boards met darkness, something stood very still. I could not make out a face. I could see a shape, tall, thin, wrong in the way it held itself. It was as if it was trying to imitate the posture of a person standing casually, but didn't understand what casual means. Its shoulders were too high. Its arms hung too long. And I saw, briefly, a pale oval where a face should have been, turned toward me. Then it moved. Not forward, not toward us, but sideways, slipping into the darkness like it had never been there. Eric started driving before I could say anything. Gravel sprayed. We bumped down the spur road toward the main gravel, both vehicles moving too fast. I kept looking in my mirrors, expecting to see something behind us, running, following, keeping pace like a predator. I saw only trees. We made it to the main gravel road, and for a few minutes I felt relief. Motion feels like control. Distance feels like safety. Then, as we rounded a bend near the spot with the handmade warning sign, Eric's SUV swerved hard and stopped. I braked behind him, heart pounding, and ran up to his window. "What?" I said. He pointed through the windshield. In the middle of the road, standing in pale afternoon light, was a deer. Except it wasn't standing like a deer. It was upright, not fully human upright, but balanced on its hind legs, forelegs bent in front like arms that didn't know what to do. Its head was a deer's head, long snout, ears high, but the neck looked too thick, the shoulders too narrow, and the eyes were wrong. Not glowing like in movies, just wrong in their focus, fixed on us with a steadiness that felt intentional. Maddie screamed behind me. Nora's voice rose, sharp, "Go, go." Eric slammed the horn. The sound blasted through the trees, harsh and desperate. The deer thing didn't flinch. It tilted its head slowly, like it was studying the sound, learning it. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It opened its mouth, and in a voice that was not a deer's, it said clearly, "Help me." It was Eric's voice. Eric's face collapsed in on itself, like his brain was trying to protect him by shutting down. He gunned the engine. The SUV lurched forward, and the deer thing moved. Fast, too fast, not leaping away like an animal startled, but stepping aside with an almost lazy confidence, letting us pass as if it had simply wanted to deliver that message. We drove the rest of the gravel road in a kind of blind urgency, the forest whipping by, every shadow feeling like it could break loose and chase us. When we hit pavement, real pavement, I felt my throat unclench slightly. Civilization has a smell: exhaust, cut grass, distant industry. We drove until we found a small sheriff's substation in a town that looked like a postcard someone had forgotten to update. We pulled into the lot like refugees. Aftermath. The deputy who took our statement was polite in the way people are polite when they've already decided what category you fall into. He listened, nodded, asked about alcohol, asked if we'd taken any drugs, asked if we were into that spooky stuff. When Eric mentioned the voices, the deputy's eyes flicked to Maddie like he was checking if she was the type to exaggerate. When I mentioned the cut cables, he asked if we'd had any disputes with locals, then wrote something down that I couldn't see. I offered to take him to the cabin. He said they'd send someone later. He told us not to go back. He said it was probably bears and probably pranksters. He said October brings weirdos. He was careful not to say anything that admitted the possibility of something truly abnormal, because admitting that would mean responsibility. Before we left, I asked if anyone had gone missing in that area recently. The deputy hesitated just long enough to be noticeable, then said, "People go missing in the mountains. It's a big place." And then he changed the subject to our license plates. We drove home without stopping except for gas and coffee and bathroom breaks, like we were trying to outrun a thought. The whole ride, none of us played music. None of us wanted extra noise. In the weeks afterward, normal life resumed the way it always does: bills, work, emails. But the cabin followed us in small ways. Nora started locking the deadbolt the moment the sun set, even though we live in a safe neighborhood. Maddie stopped sleeping with her bedroom door open. Eric, who'd always mocked paranormal anything, refused to talk about it at all, like language might invite it back. I read the notebook slowly, page by page, over several nights. The entries got worse as October progressed. The writer described men hearing their own voices calling from the woods. He described finding deer carcasses arranged. He He described a thing that would stand at the edge of firelight and watch, learning faces. And then the last entry, dated October 31st, was short. It wore my brother's voice today. I saw it move wrong. It is not a man in a mask. It is a borrower. If you read this, do not answer it. Do not go to it. Let it starve on your silence. I tried to find information about H.L. McCrae, not online gossip, but real records. Old census documents. Logging camp rosters. I found a reference to a Harold McCrae in that county in the 1930s, listed as a laborer. I found a mention in a local history blog about a McCrae boy who died in a fall near an old grate. Nothing definitive. The mountains keep their paperwork sloppy. I also tried to contact Cal through the rental platform. His account vanished. The listing was gone, not unavailable, gone, like it had never existed. When I called the phone number that had texted Eric, it was disconnected. A month later, a small local news article popped up in my feed. Not because I followed that area, but because algorithms love stories about missing hikers. The headline was bland. 2 tourists reported missing after weekend trip. Different names, different circumstances, but the location was close enough that my stomach turned. The article quoted the sheriff's office saying it was likely a navigation issue and wildlife. The comments were full of people joking about mountain boogers. That was when I did the thing I'd sworn I wouldn't do. I went back, not to the cabin, not onto that property, but to the town. I needed to know whether we'd been singled out or whether we'd stumbled into something that happened in cycles, like the turning of leaves. I took the notebook with me, wrapped in a towel like it was fragile evidence. In town, I found a small historical society in a converted house, run by an older woman named Mrs. Larkin, who had the kind of patience that comes from years of listening to people romanticize your home. I introduced myself, said I'd stayed in a cabin nearby, said I'd found an old notebook. I did not lead with voice-stealing creature because I wanted her to keep talking. When she saw the name on the first page, H.L. McCrae, her face changed subtly. Not fear exactly, more like recognition of a story she'd heard too many times. She asked where I'd found it. I hesitated, then told her enough. Her mouth tightened. That property, she said, choosing her words carefully, has a history. What kind? I asked. She sighed and leaned back, fingers folded. There were logging camps up those hollers in the early 20th century. Men came in from all over. Some never left. People blamed accidents, fever, drinking. But the old folk said there was something in the woods that learned you, that called you, that made you walk out to it like you were sleepwalking. I asked if she believed it. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said quietly, I believe people are missing. I believe the mountains are honest about one thing. If you underestimate them, they will take you. I showed her the line about borrowers' voices. She nodded slowly. Borrowed man, she said. That's one name. I asked about the cabin owner. Her gaze sharpened. Cal, she repeated, like tasting the name. Cal is not his real name. It never is. Then she stood up, walked to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder without looking at the label, as if she'd done it before. She slid a newspaper clipping across the table. Different from ours. Newer. Late 1990s. The headline, Cabin Fire Claims One. The article described a fire at a remote property. The owner's name was different, but the location description matched. The article said the fire was likely accidental. It mentioned odd artifacts found on site, dismissed as folklore decor. It quoted a deputy, same tone, same dismissal. I asked Mrs. Larkin why she'd kept that folder. She said, because every few years, someone comes in here with a story they don't want to tell out loud. And I don't like being the person who smiles and says, oh honey, that's just the wind. I left with a photocopy of the clipping and a heaviness that felt like confirmation, not of a specific creature, not of a neat supernatural answer, but of a pattern. Remote place. Missing people. Authorities minimizing. Locals warning. A sense that whatever is out there benefits from being treated like a joke. The residue. I did not go back to the cabin. I did not drive down that gravel road again. I did not look for the warning sign. I left town before dusk, like the man on the ATV had told us. Back home, I sealed the notebook and the strip of skin in a plastic container and put it in a storage bin in the far back of our garage. I told myself it was to preserve evidence, but the truth is simpler. I wanted it out of the house without throwing it away. I didn't want to disrespect whatever history it belonged to, but I also didn't want it near our bed, near our life, near the small daily rituals that make you feel safe. For months after, I would wake up sometimes around 3 a.m., always around 3 o'clock, which I know is a cliche, but bodies don't care about cliches. And I would listen. The house would be quiet. The neighborhood would be quiet. And then, in that quiet, my mind would replay the cadence of my own voice from outside that cabin window, saying, "I'm outside. Just open up." It was the worst part, even more than the deer thing standing upright in the road. Because the deer thing was obviously wrong. Your own voice is not supposed to betray you.